Tip-tap shoes, hear that stomp. Pull up a chair, let your shoulders hop. Tiny tales from the tallest trees. Mini pines, come and sway with these. Hey! Mini pines, true crime time. Kick up your heels as the stories unwind. Relax your mind, let the past chime in. We laugh, we learn, let the good tunes spin. Mini pines, true crime time. Sip a little calm while the decades rhyme. Settle right in as the ages sing. History's a hoop with a little swing.
Good evening and welcome back to My Mini Pines. This is Becca. Thanks for joining me. And tonight I've got a little story for you. One that might seem familiar and yet maybe a little different. Tonight I'm going to take you up to the Selkirk Mountains in North Idaho. I'm so glad you're here. There's something about this part of the world, the Idaho Panhandle, northeastern Washington, the country just south of the Canadian border, that gets under your skin in a very particular way. It isn't the dramatic postcard kind of beautiful. It doesn't announce itself. It's quieter than that, darker, in a way that feels alive rather than threatening. Old growth cedar, so tall you have to tip your head back to find the top. Granite ridges draped in mist. Lakes so cold, and still they look like mirrors that have forgotten what they're supposed to reflect. And somewhere in all of that, in the rugged, rarely trafficked country of the Selkirk Mountains, something has been watching us for a very long time. Or at least that's what people say. So tonight on Mini Pines, we're heading into the Selkirks to spend some time with the story of Bigfoot. Yeah, Bigfoot. And I want to be clear from the start. This isn't a story about whether Bigfoot is real. You can decide that for yourself. This is a show about what people have seen, what they've reported, what the land itself seems to invite. Because whether you believe it or don't, the Selkirk Mountains are the kind of place that makes you want to believe in something large and ancient and just barely out of sight. So come with me. Let's go in. First, of course, a little geography, because where a story lives matters as much as the story itself. The Selkirk Mountains span the Idaho Panhandle, a northwestern Washington and southeastern British Columbia area. They stretch roughly 200 miles from Mica Peak near Coeur d'Alene all the way north into Canada. And at their widest, they run about 30 miles across. They are not the Rockies. They are older than the Rockies, older than almost anything you can picture. The rock beneath your feet in the Selkirks is somewhere between 850 million and 1.5 billion years old. That's not geology. That's almost theology. The terrain was shaped by glaciers, enormous sheets of ice, 4,000 feet deep in places. They carved the valleys, scooped out the lake beds, and sculpted the granite into rugged, angular peaks we see today. The result is a landscape of significant valley to summit elevation gains, steep canyons, and forests so dense that old growth stands of red cedar and hemlock block most of the afternoon light before it ever touches the ground. In the Idaho Panhandle alone, the Selkirks are home to wolverines, lynx, gray wolves, cougars, and grizzly bears. They once sheltered the last naturally occurring herd of woodland caribou in the continuous United States. An animal so rare and so elusive that most Idahoans have never seen one. The Salmo-Priest Wilderness in northeastern Washington, the only designated wilderness in the entire Selkirk Range, encompasses nearly 40,000 acres of wilderness, so remote that the trails there seem almost no traffic for months at a time. And somewhere in there, along the Idaho-Washington border, runs what the Pacific Northwest Trail describes as the furthest inland temperature rainforest in North America. A rainforest in Idaho. This place contains multitudes. I tell you all of this because the Selkirks are not just picturesque. They are genuinely vast, genuinely difficult, genuinely unknowable in the way that only very old, very large, very wild places can be. And if you were something large and dark and very good at not being seen, this is exactly where you would live. Long before white settlers arrived in this country, long before there were logging roads or trail cameras or online databases, the peoples of this region already had a name for what lived in the mountains. The Kootenai or Kootenai people were the dominant culture across the watershed of the Kootenai River, which winds through the southeastern British Columbia and then northern Idaho. They were, in the words of later historians, a people of two worlds. Mountain people who ice fished through the winters, gathered berries and waterfowl through the summers, and hunted alpine game in the high country. They knew these mountains intimately. Every creek, every canyon, every place where the light doesn't quite reach. And in their traditional stories, recorded in the early 20th century by the German-American anthropologist Franz Boas, the giants were real. Boas documented multiple Kootenai legends describing enormous, dangerous beings that prowled the wilderness. They were generally understood to be dim-witted, but physically overwhelming. Some stories suggest these giants were not a separate species at all, but rather humans who had undergone a horrifying transformation, hunters who had done something terrible, something involving self-cannibalism in a moment of madness, and emerged from the other side as something that was no longer recognizably human, skeletal, ravenous, driven only by hunger. One traditional Kootenai story recorded by Boas tells of one such transformed giant who was killing and eating his own relatives. The community, unable to confront him directly, lured him to a cliff top overlooking Kootenai Lake and pushed him in. Now I want to sit with that for a moment because that's a story that carries an enormous amount of weight. It isn't just a monster story. It's a story about what happens when something human crosses a line it cannot uncross, and about the monstrous as a consequence can be, about the community's responsibility to protect itself, even from one of its own. That's not mythology for the sake of entertainment. That's moral architecture. The Coeur d'Alene people, whose traditional territory sits just south of the Selkirks, had their own tradition. The giants in Coeur d'Alene oral history were described as enormous, taller than the highest teepees. Their faces were darkened. They wore bearskins or other hides with hair left on. They lived in caves in the rocks. They were fond of fish and would steal salmon right out of people's traps. They could be bold when they encountered a lone person or a single dwelling, and more cautious around groups. Now, what I find remarkable about these descriptions is how consistent they are across different traditions, different peoples, different languages, and how consistent they remain with what people are still reporting today. Tall, dark-furred or dark-colored, associated with water and fish, more curious than aggressive, bolder alone than in numbers. Either there is something real in these mountains that has been generating consistent reports for a very long time, or human beings across entirely different cultures have been independently arriving at the same detailed description of something that doesn't exist. I'll let you sit with that. In the 1970s, a former Yeti hunter named Peter Byrne, a man who had spent time tracking cryptids in Nepal before turning his attention to North America, developed a classification system for Bigfoot activity. He called the Pacific Northwest, the coastal mountains of Washington and Oregon and Northern California, Area 1. It was the epicenter, the hotspot, the place with the most reported encounters in the entire continent. But Byrne also identified an Area 2. And Area 2 was, well, not far from here. He described it as the West Kootenays of British Columbia, the Interior Plateau, and northern Idaho, the Selkirk country. According to Byrne's research, these mountains collectively represented the second highest concentration of Bigfoot sightings in all of North America. Think about that. Not the most famous place, not the place on posters, the second most active zone on an entire continent. And most people outside of a very specific circle of researchers have never heard that framing. Idaho itself, which straddles the Selkirks in the north and extends south through the Sawtooth and Bitterroot ranges, has logged over 100 documented Bigfoot sightings. Over 100. That puts the state fourth in the nation for reported encounters, behind only Washington, Oregon, and West Virginia. The Idaho Bigfoot Research Team, based out of Sandpoint, which sits in the shadow of the Selkirks, has cataloged 40 sightings in the Coeur d'Alene Mountains and Selkirk Range alone since 2015. The Sandpoint connection matters because Sandpoint is right there at the base of these mountains, on the shores of Lake Pend Oreille, and the reporting culture in that area has been active for decades. The team has documented wood knocks, audio responses that researchers describe as distant whoops, 17-inch tracks near Cascade Lake, a 7-foot figure captured on a drone's thermal imaging during a 2020 St. Joe River investigation, though snow obscured any tracks the next morning. Now, I'm not asking you to take any of that as proof of anything. What I'm asking you to notice is the consistency. The same details over and over from people who don't know each other across a span of years and miles. Large, dark figure, bipedal, nocturnal or crepuscular, most active at dawn and dusk, associated with waterways, leaving tracks at the edges of things where forest meets meadow, where creek meets clearing. Something is generating these reports. What that something is, that's the question that makes this interesting. Now, I want to tell you about a man named John Bringsley. John Bringsley was a veteran woodsman, a hunter, and a fisherman who lived in Kootenai country for more than 35 years at the time of his encounter. He knew these mountains. He knew what bears looked like. He knew what elk sounded like through moving brush. He knew his way around the wilderness in the way that only someone who has spent decades in it can know a place. One weekend morning in the autumn of 1960, Bringsley parked his 1931 coupe on a deserted logging road that branched off 6 Mile Road, northeast of Nelson, British Columbia, and he headed into the bush with a bucket. He was going to pick huckleberries. He found a good patch about 150 yards from the road and went down on his knees to work. He'd been there about 15 minutes, filling his pail, not thinking about much, the way you don't when you're doing something simple and physical in a quiet place. And then, for no particular reason he could name later, he looked up. There was something standing about 40 feet away from him on a slight rise in the ground. At first, he thought it was a bear. And that's what he said. At first, I thought it was a bear. And that instinct makes sense. He was in bear country. He knew bears. He was not a man who would startle easily. But then he looked closer. I looked closer at it, he said, and realized it wasn't an animal. It was more like a human being. The creature stood somewhere between 7 and 9 feet tall. It had very wide shoulders and no visible neck. Its head appeared to sit directly on top of its shoulders. Its face, Bringsley said, was ape-like. Its ears lay flat against the side of its head. It had thick arms and what Bringsley described as human-like hands with fingernails. Its entire body was covered in smooth hair, silver blue in color, about 4 inches long. And it was watching him. Its head was cocked to the side, Bringsley said, like it was trying to figure out what I was doing. I wouldn't say it looked menacing at all, but it was sure curious to see what I was doing. Bringsley stood frozen. The creature stood and studied him. 2 minutes passed, which if you've ever been stared at by something large and wild and unexplained in the deep woods, you know is a very, very long time. And then the creature began to walk toward him. Bringsley didn't wait to find out what it wanted. He abandoned his huckleberry pail in the brush and ran for his vehicle. He got in, started the engine, and drove down that logging road as fast as the old coupe could carry him. He came back the next day, this time with a rifle and several friends. He found the area where the encounter had occurred, but there was nothing there. No tracks they could make out, no sign, just the quiet of the Selkirk forest closing back in over whatever had happened. Bringsley's story appeared in the Nelson Daily News on October 4th, 1960. It was picked up by the magazine Fate in their February 1961 issue. Researchers John Green and Bob Titmus, two of the most respected Sasquatch investigators of the era, eventually interviewed Bringsley directly, and his account was included in formal Sasquatch literature and a subsequent sworn statutory declaration. He was a credible man, describing a specific, detailed encounter. He had no reason to make it up. And the place where it happened, near the headwaters of a stream called Lemon Creek, close to a small body of water that is now named, appropriately, Sasquatch Lake. It sits deep in the Selkirk Mountains near the western edge of the Kootenai Glacier Provincial Park. Sasquatch Lake. Someone named that before Bringsley ever went picking huckleberries there. That name was already on the maps. Let's jump south across the border into Bonner County, Idaho, into the Selkirks on the American side. It's May 12th, 1997. 2 men, Bobby Short and Gene Woodruff, who was accompanied by a 16-year-old son, were bear hunting on a remote logging road. Woodruff had lived in the Sandpoint area for 30 years. He knew the local wildlife the way John Bringsley did, not as a casual observer, but as someone who had spent decades in the field. They weren't looking for Bigfoot. They were looking for bear. What they found was a track in the soft, muddy soil at the edge of the road. The slope was about 20 degrees. The mud was freshly disturbed, and pressed into it was a footprint. 14 inches long, 7 inches wide, 2 inches deep. 3 toes, not 5, which made it unusual even by the already unusual standards of a reported Bigfoot tracks, most of which show 5 toes. The impression showed clear toe marks and no signs of fabrication. No tool marks, no drag patterns that would suggest something being pressed in from above. Woodruff, who weighed about 200 pounds, pressed his own foot into the mud nearby for comparison. His track was much shallower, based on the depth of the print relative to his own. He estimated the creature that had left it weighed somewhere between 4 and 500 pounds. The track was cast and documented. It became, in the language of Idaho Bigfoot research, a cornerstone piece of evidence, not because it proved anything definitely, but because of who found it, how carefully it was documented, and the fact that it resisted easy explanation. What was a 3-toed, 14-inch, 2-inch deep track doing on a logging road on a 20-degree slope in the Selkirk Mountains? Woodruff didn't have an answer. He just knew what he saw. I want to take a moment away from specific incidents and just talk about the mountains at night, because so much of the Bigfoot literature focuses on what people see. But I think the sonic environment of the Selkirks is underappreciated. These are mountains where the grizzly bear has made a comeback, where gray wolves move through corridors that cross 3 countries, where the wolverine, an animal so rarely seen that many wildlife biologists spend entire careers in the field without a confirmed sighting, hunts the high ridges. It is not a quiet wilderness at night. It is loud in ways that don't always make sense. Elk bugle. Coyotes do things with their voices that sound like many different animals. Great horned owls produce sounds that, coming out of darkness in an old-growth forest, are not immediately recognizable as an owl. And then there are the vocalizations that researchers in this area have documented and cannot account for. What they describe as distant whoops, wood knocks, low moaning calls that don't match any known species. In 2021 near Priest Lake, that long, cold, glacially carved lake in the heart of Idaho Selkirks, the Idaho Bigfoot research team was conducting an audio survey. They were using recordings designed to mimic primate calls, and what they heard back in the dark from somewhere out in the timber were responses. Distant whoops, not elk, not wolf, not owl, not nothing. I'm telling you what to make of that, but I'm also telling you that at Priest Lake in the dark, in the Selkirk Mountains, someone called out into the wilderness and something called back. One of the things I find most compelling about the Selkirk area Bigfoot reports, when you read through them carefully, is the profile of the people making them. We're not talking about casual tourists. We're talking, in case after case, about hunters, fishermen, woodsmen, people who have spent decades in this specific wilderness. People who, more than almost anyone, would be positioned to correctly identify a bear or an elk or a man in a costume, or a trick of light and shadow. John Bringsley, 35 years in Kootenai Country. Gene Woodruff, 30 years in the Sandpoint area. Todd Stevens and the Idaho Bigfoot research team. People who spend their nights and weekends in the backcountry specifically to understand what's there. These are not people who startle easily. These are not people who confuse a black bear for a 9-foot biped with silver blue fur and human-like hands. And yet, they come back with these stories. Quietly. Often reluctantly, sometimes only after years. Because there is a cost to telling the story. There is still, in 2024, a social penalty for saying, I was alone in the woods and I saw something I couldn't explain. The late primatologist Jane Goodall, arguably the most accomplished field observer of great apes who ever lived, was asked about Bigfoot in a 2018 interview. She said, I'm a romantic. I would like Bigfoot to exist. I've met people who swear they've seen Bigfoot. There's something. I don't know what it is. Jane Goodall, the woman who spent decades in the forests of Gombe, there's something. I don't know what it is. I think about that a lot. The indigenous traditions of this region, Kootenai, Coeur d'Alene, Kalispell, and others, didn't treat Bigfoot as a simple animal to be hunted or avoided. They treated these beings as something in between, something that occupied a boundary space between the human world and the wilderness, something that enforced rules about how people behaved in wild places. In many traditions across the Columbia Plateau and the interior Northwest, Bigfoot-like being was understood as a kind of guardian, a presence that noticed when people were careless or greedy or arrogant in the back country. Not a monster, not a pet, something older and harder to categorize. The Lakota tradition further east speaks of Chaitanka, the big elder brother, a being that appears in times when human behavior needs to be corrected. Some Columbia Plateau traditions describe the creature as Istithi or Siahama, a being associated with the land in ways that go beyond the physical. And I find in reading these accounts that the emotional register of Indigenous encounters with these beings is often different from the terror that characterizes most modern Bigfoot stories. Not always, but sometimes the feeling described is closer to awe, to the experience of having encountered something that knows you are there and has decided for now to let you pass. That distinction feels important. The difference between a monster that could harm you and a presence that simply reminds you are a visitor here. Now, when I come back to the geography one more time, because I think it explains something. The Selkirks are not the most famous mountains in the Pacific Northwest. They're not the Cascades. They're not the Tetons. They're not the mountains that many people drive past on their way to somewhere more famous without stopping, without looking up. And yet Peter Burns Area 2, Idaho's 100+ documented sightings, the Idaho Bigfoot research team cataloging 40 cases on these specific mountains in under a decade. A small lake in British Columbia named Sasquatch Lake before anyone admits to seeing anything there. There's something about these mountains that generate stories consistently across time, across cultures, across the line between folklore and field report. Maybe it's the terrain itself, rugged enough, remote enough to shelter something that doesn't want to be found. Maybe it's the wildlife corridors that cross the U.S.-Canada border here, the same routes used by grizzlies and wolves and caribou, routes that pass through some of the least trafficked wilderness in the country. Or maybe it's something about what these mountains are. Geologically ancient, shaped by ice, containing somewhere along the Idaho-Washington border a temperate rainforest that has no business being this far inland. A place that is, by any definition, a place where the rules of normal geography don't quite apply. The Selkirks are in many ways a secret, known intimately by the people who live in their shadow and almost unknown to everyone else. And secrets in the Pacific Northwest have a way of being kept very, very well. So I want to end with something small. Every Bigfoot story at its core is a story about a threshold. Someone is moving through the world, picking huckleberries, hunting a bear, hiking a trail, doing something ordinary. And then something tips over, and the ordinary world opens up into something else entirely. Something that doesn't have a name yet, something that watches them with what they can only describe as curiosity. And then it's over. And they're left standing there, holding an empty pail, trying to figure out what they just saw. What I love about these stories, the reason I wanted to spend time in the Selkirks with you tonight, is that they're not really about a creature. They're about that moment. The moment when the world you think you understand turns out to be larger than you knew, older than you knew, more inhabited than you knew. John Brinsley stood in a huckleberry patch in the Selkirk Mountains in the autumn of 1960 and looked up, and something looked back. Whatever it was, whatever it is, it looked back with what he described as curiosity. Not aggression, not hunger. Curiosity. Like it was trying to figure out what he was doing there. Maybe that's the real question these mountains are asking us. Not whether Bigfoot exists, but whether we understand our own place in landscapes this old and this wild. Whether we know how to be in them without assuming we're the most significant thing in them. The Selkirks are older than almost anything on this continent. They have held ice and fire and the slow grind of glaciers. They have held the Kootenai people's stories of giants for generations before the first road was cut through them. They hold right now wolves and wolverines and grizzly bears, and if the reports mean anything at all, something else. Something that walks upright. Something with silver blue fur and curious eyes, and no particular interest in being explained. I'm very grateful for the time that you spent here with me tonight. I hope you enjoyed our trip through the Selkirks. And as always, keep your eyes open, enjoy nature, and hopefully you have a chance to walk a quiet road, to take a moment, and to breathe in what Mother Nature has for you there.
Well, that's our show tonight. We laughed and kept it light. From the first hello to the last goodbye. That's our show tonight. Thanks for listening. Tip your hat and keep those toes a-twisting as the lights go